got trouble.
We got trouble.
How much trouble?
Too much trouble. Go ahead,
It's not right. Now billions of dollars want to be borrowed from the White House to help feed and house them. Where the is there in our country? Not just in this neighborhood, but in our country. All these kids, really?
But your luck will change.
Treating people with respect. What we just saw was so stunning. If you believe, as we do, that every child, every person has a spark of divinity in them and is therefore worthy of respect, what we saw in those rooms was dazzling.
Then they wanted a fence. Well, the fence is... The fence is now basically complete.
Called a turnaround. This is the only president that I'm aware of that ever counted turnarounds as being deportations. They're not deportations, but it's what should have happened to our Marine sergeant when he got there and he said, I wanted to turn around. The barriers wouldn't let me. Let him turn around. That's what we need to be doing. Send them back. Don't let them come in. And the mass influx will stop immediately. All we'll have to do is let the word get out. You're not coming in illegally. Do it the right way. Apply like the million or so do every year that come in legally.
Oh my God. I feel alone right now in this. And I'm very saddened by it.
If you believe, as we do, that every child, every person has a spark of divinity in them and is therefore worthy of respect.
Maybe they'll need a moat. Maybe they want alligators in the moat.
Welcome, this is Forrest Wilson. You're listening to The Resistance. What has happened to the leadership in this country? I mean, really. What has happened? I don't know if you heard Nancy Pelosi. Each of them has a spark of divinity. Have you ever noticed that people tend to rely on the prior work experience when they assume another job? In other words, people bring elements of their prior position to their new position. That's why the resume is a standard document we present to a prospective employer. That employer wants to ensure that you have some level of skill or education so that you can perform the job you're seeking. Did we see the community organizer's resume before we hired him? Hell no. Many wondered if he was even born in the USA. I believe he was. Now, do you think it's a coincidence that our southern border, those charged to protect it, and every state on the southern border is overwhelmed? Could it be the result of community organizing and a community organizer? I mean, that was his past, right? I mean, that was his body of experience, with the exception of a couple of short stints in the Illinois State Senate and the United States Senate. I'd never heard of a community organizer until Barack Obama came along. But you have to hand it to him. He's agitated for immigration reform and created a crisis on our southern border, a man-caused disaster, and refuses to take action to stop it. That's because he designed it. This overwhelming of the system is a tried and true method of change for the professional agitator, otherwise known as community organizer. What about the consequences of failing to uphold his constitutional duty that the United States shall guarantee to every state a Republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion, even if we're being invaded by children? But look, it's more than children, isn't it? It's adults. It's OTMS, other than Mexicans. It's jihadists or special interest aliens from Yemen, Egypt, and really all over the Middle East. Not to mention the personal lives destroyed by this moron, this progressive, this community organizer. What about Marianne Mendoza? Her son, a police officer, was killed when an illegal drove down the road with a blood alcohol content level of 0.24% and crashed into Sergeant Brandon Mendoza, killing him. This administration does not deport anyone, even criminal illegal aliens. Those illegal aliens, they're part of the fundamental change being foisted upon our citizens, designed to get as many new Democrat voters as possible to ensure that communist progressives remain in perpetual power. According to Chris Crane, president of the National Immigration and Customs Enforcement Council 118 of the American Federation of Government Employees, yes, a union leader, in sworn testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee on February 13, 2013, with 11 million illegal aliens in the U.S., ICE agents are now prohibited from arresting illegal aliens solely on the charges of illegal entry or visa overstay, the two most frequently violated sections of U.S. immigration law. In 2013 alone, ICE freed 36,000 convicted criminal aliens. Convicted! 16,000 of them had drunk or drugged driving convictions. Mariam Mendoza's story is being repeated over and over and over again. And what about TSA, Transportation Security Administration? They're allowing the undocumented to fly without any form of ID. I can't even get on a plane with a bottle of shampoo, much less get on a plane without an ID. We've lost control of the border, and it's threatening the very sovereignty of the border states and the sovereignty of this nation. In other words, the ability to govern our country. And for what? And now comes the opposition with a plan to sue the administration. The president needs to be impeached along with all of the progressives in Congress. That's the answer. But impeachment under a Democrat-controlled Senate would be a repeat of the Clinton impeachment proceedings. You better hope and pray that the midterms hold the House and take the Senate. That way, the charges, impeachable charges that John Boehner has brought and laid out in this suit, can be part of the articles of impeachment. I want you to listen to someone who's written extensively on this border crisis, and her name is Cheryl Chumley, columnist for the Washington Times. She's also the 2008-2009 Robert Novak Journalism Fellow with the Phillips Foundation. Cheryl, welcome to The Resistance.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we've got an invasion going on, and the politicians tell us we need immigration reform. Don't we need to stop the flow first?
Well, exactly. That should be step one, and I favor no talks on Capitol Hill until the border is clamped down on, because all talks about reform is only bureaucratic public relations speak, and it doesn't do anything to stem the flow of illegal immigrants into our nation unless we first lock down the border.
And how much of this do you think, this invasion, is organized at the community level? In other words, community organizers south of the border?
Well, there's a piece on WND actually right now. I was just reading through it earlier today that says that Mexican and Guatemalan authorities actually announced a deal on July 7th to fast-track illegals up through Mexico to America's borders. And that may or may not be the case, but at the same time, this was designed by President Obama and his White House and his pro-amnesty supporters.
So I guess the goal is we overwhelm all of the border states, we overwhelm ICE, we overwhelm all these different federal agencies, and then he comes in with an amnesty solution and a immigration reform act.
Yeah, and Congress doesn't even have to approve, because by that time it'll be too late. We would have had amnesty de facto in America. This is exactly what's happening right now. I was reading reports earlier this week that, up to 70% of those who have crossed our borders illegally in recent months have already disappeared. They're not showing up for their court dates, and it doesn't take a brain surgeon to predict this was going to happen. But here we are. They've disappeared among the 11 million illegals already in our nation.
Now, some of these people coming across are special interest aliens, and I know you've written about some of these folks. What is a special interest alien?
Well, I've written a little bit about how some of the people coming up through the borders are, affiliated with gangs and so forth. But as far as any type of illegal immigrant coming up from Central America, crossing into America, being of benefit to America's economy or future, I know very few instances of that.
Yeah, they have low skills, no English-speaking capability, many uneducated, many of them are children.
Yeah.
Now, you also write in one of your articles a quote from Michelle Obama when she was speaking to the United Latin American Citizens. We cannot afford to wait on Congress to lift up our next generation. We can't afford to wait on anybody when it comes to our kids' futures. I have to wonder what kids she's talking about.
Talking about the illegals, and this is what's an outrage. It's kind of a double whammy outrage with Michelle Obama, because first off, she's not a duly elected official. She doesn't represent anybody. Nobody voted for her. She's the first lady. So for her to, take the national platform and try and sway, America's public on a policy issue that is of such great importance, it's a little bit outrageous anyhow. But then for her to claim that we need to protect, basically serve the illegals and forget about the Americans who were born as citizens in this nation, that's just something, it's a slap in the face to America.
Yeah, it really is, and I'm really angered at everything that I read, especially your columns. And when we get back, I want to go into another one of your articles about, I guess it's nuclear material that was found at the University of Mosul, but we'll talk about that when we come right back on The Resistance. We're talking with Cheryl K. Chumley, Washington Times columnist, who's written extensively about this border crisis. AM 600, WVOB, The Answer. You're listening to Forrest Wilson on The Resistance.
Let's return to We the People with Forrest Wilson. Once again, here's Forrest.
And we're back. We're talking with Cheryl K. Chumley of the Washington Times on this border crisis. And one of your articles, Cheryl, is about terrorist groups having seized nuclear materials from Mosul University in Iraq.
Yeah, and this is a little bit surprising that it's gone under the radar, it seems, quite a bit, maybe because of the border issue is so intense. But back on July 8th, Iraq wrote a letter to the UN and advised them, Iraq's UN ambassador advised the UN Atomic Agency that terrorist groups seized 88 pounds of uranium compounds that were kept at Mosul University. The UN is aware of the seizure, and their response was that this was low-grade type materials, no need to worry. But the Iraq's UN ambassador said that these materials can actually be used to manufacture weapons of mass destruction. And, it's a little bit concerning when you think of the situation in Iraq right now and the rise of ISIS or ISIL, whichever one you prefer. And when you think of our borders at the south being so fluid, it's just a security risk to us as a nation.
And, this is where I believe the president is really falling down, because Article 4 talks about invasion of the states and how the federal government is obliged constitutionally to protect the states against invasion. They don't talk about the invaders in terms of armed personnel or that sort of thing. I mean, children can be invaders. But in this case where you've got nuclear material gone missing, and obviously in the hands of ISIS or ISIL, and then you've got prayer rugs being found at border crossings, I mean, what does that tell you?
That tells you that we need to take our border situation a little bit more seriously insofar as considering it as security issue and not so much a political issue like the current administration is regarding it. Children at the border, you're right, I consider that an invasion. A lot of people look at these poor children and their heartstrings are pulled and so forth. But at the same time, you need to think what you just pointed out, a prayer rug found there, that's kind of a red flag. And, if I were a terrorist right now, I would be looking at our border situation in the United States as an ideal time to make my move.
I think it's a major military blunder. And we are at war, whether the president wants to admit it or not. He can't stop this war. The only thing he can do is fight it, because these jihadists have vowed to end the great Satan, the West, and Israel. And even as we speak, rockets rain down on Israel. And part of this, I think, is because there's just such a lack of attention to Iraq and all of the different issues that are happening in the Middle East.
Well, I think you're right on that count. I think a big portion of the unrest that we're seeing right now around the world is due to the perception of the Obama administration as being weak on foreign policy. You know, they've waffled back and forth on what to do about red lines in Syria and so forth. They've allowed Putin in Russia to come in and seize the day and proclaim himself, you know, as the hero for, dealing with Assad over in Syria. He was even voted Man of the Year and so forth. The United States has been kind of pushed to the side, and what happens is now all these unsettled areas in the Mideast look at this as the absolute best chance they have of stirring up some chaos. It's the Carter administration all over again.
Well, I think it's worse because back when Jimmy Carter was in office, as you recall, there wasn't this rise of Islamic fundamentalism that we have today. I think that this is really a seminal moment, and it's going to result, if we're not vigilant, in a smoking city. I mean, it's coming, and we're doing nothing about it. Now, apparently, there's also some news reports that the border enforcement has been moved back 40 miles from the border in Texas. And this is amazing to me. I mean, I can't understand why they should move the border forward into Mexico as opposed to bringing it back into Texas.
I agree, and I think, you know, a lot of these states want to take more aggressive action to protect their borders because they're, of course, dealing with the frontline invasion of it. You know, it's different when you're a politician in D.C. and can point your finger, you know, wherever you want and proclaim policies, but it's a lot different when you're down there dealing with illegals in your backyard. And I think a lot of these states are hesitant to take stronger action, like, you know, call out the National Guard and so forth, because the Supreme Court has made it clear that, you know, enforcement of the borders and oversight of the borders belongs in the hands of the federal government, and they're perhaps worried about being sued. But, you know, as days go by and weeks, and days turn into weeks, we're just getting more and more illegals into America.
Yes, and possibly special interest aliens, these terrorists from the Middle East. You also put out an article on New York City creating an ID card so 500,000 illegal immigrants can get services. And the interesting thing about that article is Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, his comment regarding applicants aren't going to be asked about their legal status, and council members and the mayor say it's really aimed at helping the city's most left-out citizens. The illegals. He uses the term citizens.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? You know, I just can't believe that New York City would take it upon itself to violate, you know, existing U.S. law, to thumb their noses at existing laws that, you know, you're not supposed to have illegals in this nation at all. But for New York City as a government to take it upon itself and create ID cards so these illegals can be more legitimized than they already are, you know, it's topsy-turvy rule of law in this nation. And well, what these ID cards actually do is they give illegals the right to and the ability to rent an apartment and obtain, you know, taxpayer-funded services and so forth. Things that existing Americans who are legal citizens sometimes have a hard enough time obtaining.
Well, you're in Washington, D.C., and what is the, outside, the people that are truly outside of the political spectrum, what are thoughts of people in Washington, D.C. as it relates to all these crises, this issue on the border, and all the other things that this administration and the various federal agencies are doing?
Well, it's completely heated, as you might know. You know, you've got your hardcore conservatives with what I view as common sense type political views, wanting first and foremost to secure the border before they go forward with any type of deal making with Democrats in Congress. And those are people like Senator Ted Cruz, for instance, or Congressman Louis Gohmert. And then you have your rhino type conservatives, John Boehner, already cutting deals for the $3.7 billion payment so the White House can provide for these illegals. And you have Democrats steadfastly in the White House camp wanting to push forward with amnesty promises that this president made years ago that he wasn't able to bring to fruition because he was fighting for Obamacare. It's just a heated political partisan atmosphere, and in my view, it doesn't matter what policy that comes out of Capitol Hill at this point. The only thing that matters is shutting down the borders and dealing with the illegals who have already crossed.
Yeah, and I just don't see that happening anytime soon. I think it's going to take an event of some type and people literally rising up against their elected representative to stop this tide of illegal immigration.
I agree with you, sad to say, but I believe that also.
Yeah, and I believe something's going to happen. I've been talking about it on this show now for a couple of weeks, and I don't want to, completely occupy the time with this talk of the border, but this truly is a crisis of epic proportions, and the big part of it is the military blunder that I believe the commander-in-chief is making by allowing this to happen. And I think the only way out of this is, if we make it to the next election, get rid of as many of these pro-amnesty folks as we can and get elected officials in that'll do something about the border, because it's obvious the executive branch is not going to do a thing.
I agree. And, if we can't control the border, then our nation is going to crumble and just within a few years. It's not going to take long at all.
Well, I think we're going to get a smoking city long before that. Cheryl, I really appreciate you taking time on a Saturday to come on live radio and give your views. This is an interview with Cheryl Chumley of the Washington Times. If you want to go read some of her articles, you can go to the Washington Times website. Excellent work, Cheryl. Thank you for your contribution.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me, and you keep up the tough fight also. You have a great day.
You too, Cheryl. Thank you.
Bye.
You're listening to Forrest Wilson on The Resistance. That was Cheryl Chumley of the Washington Times. We'll be right back. AM 600 WBOB, The Answer.